welcome to the October edition of the Microsoft Excel Collegiate Challenge. And this month we're going to be looking at a cash flow model, or more or less, where's our money? This month's challenge is sponsored by Alvarez & Marsal, and specifically the North American Commercial Restructuring Group there. Restructuring is when companies are in distress and need outside consultants to come in and help them forecast their cash flows and understand really when cash is going to flow in and flow out of the business. So in this month's case, that's what you're going to be doing. You're looking at an oil and gas project, and you need to forecast when revenues are going to be earned. That way the company can make sure that they have the liquidity necessary to operate. In this walkthrough video, I'm going to show you how to build the model, but not answer each specific question. As long as you get the model structure right, then it's a matter of getting familiar with it and understanding the data to answer the specific questions. So let's dive into the model and start building. All right, so as we get into the model, we start at the Instructions tab. Now you'll want to read through this all in detail. I'll cover a lot of it as we go, but this will give you all the details in the model that you're building. And it also gives you some extra color on the industry that this is taking place in and kind of how Alvarez & Marsal worked with a client on a specific engagement that motivated the case. You know, all the numbers are made up, but it gives you the flavor of what it'd be like to work on a real deal. All right, we also have a second tab here where if you want to learn more about Alvarez & Marsal, please download this PDF. Just double click that to learn a little bit more, and also check out their website. The other thing you can do is actually enter your information here, and we will then pass that along to Alvarez & Marsal, who can reach out to you about specific career opportunities. All right, so now moving into the model, what we see is this Assumptions, Control, and Output tab. So this controls what goes into the model and also is going to analyze what comes out. And you'll see a lot of this is already built for us. So we really don't need to touch this tab. Much like if you get a template from one client job that you're going to take to another one, you just have to make sure the new data is up to date for that client. And then the workings of the model can still give you that analysis. So in this case, we have a number of customers in different regions with different allocations of revenue. So this is going to be what really drives a lot of our model. We also are going to control revenue recognition and how it's spread across the month, and we'll get to that in a little bit. You also see we have a data table built over here. All the numbers are the same because it's not populated yet with the data that's going to drive that. And then we have some analysis down here. Again, everything is zeros to start because we haven't built the model. But we have some very nice graphs that are going to populate once this model is working. All right, so our goal is to first get familiar with the data and then build the model workings. That way this tab populates and we can actually make some business decisions off of it. All right, so let's go look at our historical data and then do some analysis around it. So you can see I've set my spreadsheet up in advance that we're going to sum by customer, we're going to sum by region and by week, we're going to sum by the month end, and do a few other things. These are all pieces that you need to answer the questions associated with the case. Those are going to be on the Questions tab at the end. Now, to start out, we need to get our sum by customer. All right, so that's a pretty straightforward thing we can do here. We can start out, and I'm going to create all our customers, and I'm going to do that in an efficient way and just select them all as an array. All right, when I do that, I now have a dynamic array with my customers. So now that I have my customers, I'm going to set up a very simple sum here. We're just going to sum across each row. All right, when we sum across each row, we can then copy that down, and we have our sales for each customer. All right, this is just at a high level, how do we just use the sum function to sum across all of our data. All right, where it starts to get more interesting is when we start to sum by things like by region. All right, because we can see up here that we have our customers, we don't have our region data yet. So let's go get our region data. And the way we're going to do that is with an XLOOKUP. All right, so we want to look up the customer, and we have this data back on our control tab. So here we have our range of customers. Make sure we lock that with our F4, and we have our range of regions. And so XLOOKUP is going to return the region that's associated with each of the customers we're interested in. All right, so in that case, we get our customer. You can see we already have the formatting built into the spreadsheet, so yours will probably show up as green as well. All right, so we've got all of our regions now associated with each customer. And that's going to let us build our next piece of analysis, which is to sum by the region by week. All right, so before we can sum by region, we got to know how many regions we have. Here's a great time to use the unique function. All right, so we're going to take all the unique values out of those list of regions, and now we have our regions established. All right, so once we have our regions, now we can use not a sum function, but a SUMIFS. All right, the SUMIFS, the idea is that with each week, right, we have our weeks across the top here, we can sum that array of data, right? I'm going to lock it just with the rows locked. So 17 and 27 are locked because it's going to stay in the same range of rows, but we're going to have this thing move as we go across to the right. So we want that F to be able to change, but not the 17 and the 27. And we're going to sum those that are in the region we're interested in this case, Marcellus and Utica. So we highlight that. That's going to be our criteria range in this case. And F4 twice gets us to just locking the rows. And then our last piece is what criteria we want. So our criteria range is the various regions. In this case, we just want that first region. All right, so that's what we're going to queue off of. And here we have to lock a little differently. We're going to lock D, because that way as we drag this thing to the right, it's going to keep that D reference of the region that we're interested in. All right, so if we do that, we get our first answer. All right. The last piece, though, is let's make this thing a little dynamic. All right, so I'm going to hit F2 to get in here. I'm going to then put a hashtag at the end of that reference. Now you can see it highlighted in purple, that whole range of regions. And now that's going to spill down for us automatically. This is a nice feature of dynamic arrays, and we're going to use it when we can. All right, so now I'm going to jump all the way to the right out here. Control-Shift left arrow to get back, and then Control-R goes ahead and fills that all the way across. All right, and we seem to have a problem though. Why do we get zeros? Well, let's look. Ooh, so we didn't quite lock that original array, or we only locked the rows, not the columns. We want that red one to stay put. So let's go back and fix that. So our red array, that's going to be the D. Let's go ahead and put our dollar signs on. This is just where we do have to be careful in all of our locking. All right, we rerun that. It looks like we have data working well for us. And as a last piece, we might want to sum each of these regions. All right, let's go to the end and Alt equals for a quick auto sum. Let's see. There we go. And I'll actually Alt HOI lets me make that a little bit bigger. All right, so we can see the numbers. So we quickly got our regions all summed up there. As a next step, we're going to go sum by the month end, right? So you might want to have numbers by month and also by week. So in this case, notice we have some help already, and that we've already constructed the months up here, right? We have our weeks as dates, but then we can go ahead and use the end of month function, EO month, to get the month end up there as well. So now we can criteria based on that. But to do that, we want a unique list of our months. We've already used unique once, let's do it again. So in this case, we do unique of our months, and let's see what we get. Well, in this case, we got a lot more than we wanted, right? We got January, January, January 4 different times, right? Those are all the same values, so what is going on here? Well, the way the unique function works is it does the unique by column, right? That's the default option. And so we're basically asking it to do the unique elements of each column here, where we have lots of columns attached in a big, long horizontal array. If instead, we actually want the unique elements by the row, like within the single row, then we have to put a comma 1. That tells us the unique columns. And in this case, there are only, 8 unique column numbers, or sorry. Yeah, 8. No, 9. All right, we have 9 unique columns here. And so now we've pulled those all in, just making sure we use that comma 1 to tell it we want columns instead of the unique rows in this case. All right. That said, we do want the unique rows for the regions, so let's pull that down here. Let's reference our region, use our hashtag to spill it down, and now we can do another SUMIFS function. Now in this case, we've already summed by region. We just need to sum the numbers of a region that are within a certain month. So in this case, we can turn to our SUMIFS again. We're just going to use it in a horizontal sense instead. So our sum range for this first one can be our whole range of values that we have there across the weeks. We then only want to sum if the criteria range, so in this case the month, is equal to the month that we're interested in. All right, so we've locked both the sum range and the criteria range in this case. and we're going to lock just the row of what we're interested in. So we want the F to float essentially. So we get that number in, we check, let's copy that right and see what happens. And it looks like we're good that way. Now let's copy down and see what happens. In this case, we're getting the same value every time. So again, what's really important with sum ifs, as we're making our models dynamic, is to use the cell referencing carefully. Right? In this case, what's happened is I'm always referencing this top row of my weekly sums. Right? To get it to move, I have to lock the column references, but not the row references. So let's go back and fix that. So what I'm summing, let's not lock the row, take those dollar signs away, while we're still leaving our references up here on the months the same. All right, so we copy that. Let's copy that across. We still look good. Now when we copy down, we see that we get our updated values. All right, and these are the values that you can use to answer many of the questions that we have as part of the actual answers in the workbook. So you'll want to go back and look at those. All right, our next questions actually get into how many weeks are in each of these months. All right, so we don't have that data put together yet, and I actually skipped it up here at the beginning, but we see we have this region to work in. We want to figure out how many weeks are in each month. That way we can make our kind of revenue adjustments that we'll see on the next tab, and also how many weeks are there in the month, or what is the week that you're in the month. All right, so let's build a couple of formulas there. The idea with this formula is to use a COUNTIF. All right, so we can count how many times that end of month number turns up in that whole array for the month that we're currently in. All right, so if we're in January, it's going to count how many other weeks are in January. If we go all the way in and copy that to the right, we can see, well, we have 4 in January, 4 in February, 4 in March. In April, we actually have 5 weeks, because in this case, we had 5 Fridays happening in that month, which is how we're keeping track of weeks in this case. All right, so that gives us the total within the month, but it's not a running total, right? Because what we'd like to see also, the week of the month, is that it's 1 for the first week, 2 for the second week, 3 for the third week. And to do that, we have to make one important change. All right, so first, let's just copy our formula, keep our referencing constant. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a COUNTIF, and I'm going to use a dynamic range here. And so what I'm doing is I'm just using the range from F10 to F10, which is really just a single cell, to start counting how many times January shows up. All right, that might not make sense yet, but if we copy that to our next cell, we can see it starts to make more sense because now we're doing from F10 to G10. Notice that the F10 is locked, but the G10 is not. That way, as we copy to the third cell, we can see that our reference range is expanding. So as we go all the way to the right, it's going to expand out the whole way and then give us a running total that way, to where it's only counting the things that have happened to that point and before. All right, that way, it's not yet counting this January. It's not there yet. It only counts that once we get the value out there. Moreover, if we copy this thing across, we can see it resets every time we get to a new month. Because as it gets to a new month, it hasn't seen February before, so it only has that value of 1. All right, our last bit here is it's also helpful to keep track of what the first week of the month is or the last week of the month. So let's find a way to do that. So the end of the month, well, we know it's the end of the month if it changes from January to February, right? If this end of month changes, that tells us we're in a new month. So here we can just do a simple if statement to say if this month is not equal to the next month, well, it must be the end, otherwise not. Similarly with the beginning of the month, if the month we're in is not equal to the one we were just in, then we must be in a new month, otherwise not. All right, so we get those kind of simple logical formulas worked out, and now we have a nice flag that tells us here's a 1 whenever it's the end of the month, here's a 1 whenever it's the beginning of the month. All right, so why do we do all this work? Well, that way we can now sum by weeks. Right? We want to know which weeks of the month tend to have more revenue. Right? There might be some monthly kind of mini seasonal component to this. All right, so again, we can do a sum ifs here. So let's do sum ifs, and we're dealing with totals. Well, we have our totals way up here. There's our net revenue. So let's just lock that. And we're going to do that if the week of the month we just got into, so there's our week of the month, is equal to whatever our header was. All right. So in this case, let's just lock that 64 in, copy that to the right, and we see that we get lots of revenue in weeks 1, 2, or a little bit of revenue in 1 and 2, lots in 3 and 4, and not much in 5. Well, there's probably not much in 5 because there aren't many months that have 5 weeks in them. All right, so that's what this last piece is we can actually now split this up between 4-week months and 5-week months. And here we can actually use a very similar formula. So let's actually copy this down. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an extra criteria on now. All right, so the extra criteria is that in this case, it's going to be a 4-week month. And if we scroll up, we can highlight our weeks per month and put a 4 in there. All right, we copy that right. And we see 0 sales in week 5 of 4-week months. That checks out. All right, let's copy that down now. And now we just got to change that 4 to a 5. Copy that across. And we see we got our same total here for our 4 and 5 week months. If we add those up, that's going to equal the same thing that we have in the all. All right, so now we've done a good amount of historical analysis with the data. Now we want to go to our next tab and work on projecting forward so we can really understand the cash position of the company. All right, so as we get to our accounts receivable analysis on this tab, we can see a lot of it's been done for us. A lot of it's linked back to where it was before, and a lot of it's historical data. So we're going to have to fill in these areas that are kind of these light gray shaded areas to complete the model. So let me move over here. We can actually see our forecast period at the end of this region over here. And we can see we're doing the same calculations we did on the first tab. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our first tab. Let's go back and basically steal the work we've already done. All right. I'm going to copy just one of them here. I want the form of the function because I'm going to have to edit those formulas just a little bit. All right, so let's put them over here and let's see what we got. So in this case, we're doing a COUNTIF from F all the way to AR, and we're counting it if it's AS10. Well, in this case, we get 0. And that's because we need to expand the range for this first formula, not to AR, but all the way to BE, which takes us through the end of the projection range. All right, so that's one change we need to make. The next change is we need to take this, instead of being all the way through AS, nope, it worked. It updated all the way through AS, so that one looks good to us. All right, but let's copy to the right to make sure we're convinced they're actually working. And make sure it looks good overall. So we see 5 weeks in December, that looks good. We count them 1 through 5. All right. Whenever possible, recycle formulas that you've used in other parts of your model to use them again here. All right, so we're going to jump across a few areas real quick. The first thing I'm going to do actually is going to, following in that same spirit, I'm going to fill out the allocation percent and also the adjusted terms for each of these customers. And so let's actually jump back to our main tab. Right, we see our customers here. In the last exercise, we pulled in the region. Now we want to pull in the allocation, which is column F, and the adjusted terms, which is column I. All right, so over here we have our formula, right? Let's just take that formula. All right, we're going to paste our formula here. Now we don't want the region, right, which is in column D. In this case, we want the allocation percent, which we said was in column F. Now just a simple change to the formula, copy it down, and we've got that figured out. Similarly, let's just copy this formula, paste that down. Now again, we don't want the allocation percent, we want the days outstanding. And that wasn't an F, that was an I. All right, so one formula that we wrote, we can now use in multiple places to really save us time as we pull this data into the right parts of the spreadsheet to work with it. All right, we need to pull a little bit more data in, and that's going to be the revenue recognition. So let's go over to the end of this. And now the idea with revenue recognition is we can do it a couple ways, right? If we see that there are 4 weeks in a month, well, we can just say that 25% hits in each month. But we also saw from our historical data that the first couple weeks of the month tended to have lower revenue numbers, right? That's what we're adjusting for with this revenue recognition switch. Right, so this is a switch in the model, and the idea is if it's set to 1, right, you spread evenly throughout the month. If it's set to 2, right, we flip it. Now we want to use these particular numbers. So if it's a 4-week month, let's use these. If it's a 5-week month, let's use these. So we want to build our model flexibly from the start. That way we can accommodate this switch so that revenue recognition can either be 1 for even or 2 for spread. All right, so to do that, we're going to use the function choose. All right, so what choose does is it takes an input, like an index, like the 1 or the 2 that we're putting in that control cell, and then it gives you a number of options behind that of how do you want to do the calculation. All right, so in this case, what we're going to reference is that input cell, making sure we lock it. And now the first calculation is if you pick a 1, that's what we put in for our calculation. And our calculation is just simply 1 divided by the number of months we have. All right, so pretty straightforward. We can close it at this point since our parameter is set to 1, and we see we get 25%. Now note with the choose function, if we go put our 2 in now and we go back, we have an error because there's nothing in the choose function if 2 is selected. All right, so let's actually work with it a little bit and see if we can get something in there. All right, now the question is what value do we want? In this case, if a 2 is selected, that means we want to use that spread. We want to do it for 4 months. So if we go back and look at our number, for the first week of the month, with a 4-week spread, we'd want this 15% number. All right, so how do we get that? We're going to use an index match here. The idea is we're going to index over this array. So we can type index, and we're going to pull a number from this array. And which number we pull is going to depend on whether we have 4 or 5 weeks in the month and what week we are in currently. All right, so the first thing we have to do is let's do a match of whatever month how many weeks we have in the month. So we're going to match that to this array here. And we're just figuring out whether it's the first or the second one. All right. The next piece then is, well, which column do we want? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Well, we have that given right over here. We've just already calculated the week we are in the month. So we're all set on that one. We close off that function, and now we get our 15%. Right, if we pull our formula bar down, we can see a little bit more. Some of these formulas you need a lot of room to see, but you can see how we've constructed that formula. And as long as we've done it right, we can just copy across, and we see it looks like it's working. We have the seasonality basically adjusted in there. If we go back and flip to our control of 1, we should see nice even numbers per month. And that's what we see, 25 as long as we have 4 weeks, and then 20 in the case that we have 5 weeks. All right, so now that we have our revenue recognition percent, well, we got to figure out what that's going to be a base on. All right, so the amount of revenue per region, well, that's based on the percent that happens in that week. Also, the allocation of that customer in that region. And then finally, if we go back to our main tab, our sales projections, right? So we already have those built up. So what we're going to have to do is pull in what is our sales projection for a month, and then multiply by those 2 other factors. So for the first piece, let's pull in the sales projection for that month. All right, so here our XLOOKUP works well again. We're going to look up the month we're in, right? We have that up here. And we can go back over here and look it up in that first row. And then we're going to return back our adjusted revenue number. Let's just make sure that that's working. We got too few arguments. Let's double check it. It looks like I forgot to put a comma in. So, yep, this should have been F to F and then comma. All right, Excel helps us when we screw things up a little bit. So we did F12. Oh, we did F to H12 is our last one. All right, that looks good. But we actually want this first one to be F9 to H9. All right, there we get our 15,000, which is what we were expecting. Now to that, we need to multiply it by a couple of factors. Right, we're going to start out, we need to multiply that by the weekly factor. Right, make sure we lock that row. And then also multiply that by our allocation to that region. And here we're going to lock the column instead of the row. All right, once we get that, we get another error. Let's see if we can find it quickly here. Oh, it seems something cleared out for us pretty quick. All right, so we've got our number. Let's copy it to the right. We've got revenue that looks good. If we copy it down, as long as we've locked everything, we're okay. We didn't lock everything. So let's try to figure out what we didn't lock. So in this case, we can often see we locked this up here. That looks okay. Oh, no, we didn't. That was the piece we missed. So I forgot to lock AS10. Let's lock in that row. Copy that across. Copy that down. And now we look okay. So now we've got our revenue projections built out, and we're doing all right. All right, so now we have our revenue numbers. What we really want to know is when cash is going to come into the company, though. Right? To figure out when cash is going to come into the company, that's this next section, which is the receipts. Right? So when a sale happens, oftentimes a customer doesn't pay right away. Right? If we make this sale in January for $218, well, with this company, they pay 30 days later. So the date they're actually going to pay us would be equal to January 7th plus 30 days, so February 6th. All right, so we're not going to see that then until not the week of February 4th. It'll happen after February 4th, so the week of February 11th. So we have to be able to basically reference when this money is going to come in across these weeks. And it's going to be different per client based on the terms, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, or some are 90 days. All right. This is built for as the classic XLOOKUP, but with approximate matching. And I'll show you what I mean there. So the idea is what we want to look up is revenue that happened 30 days earlier, because in this case we have 30-day terms. So we can take the week we're in, right, making sure we lock that row in, minus then the terms, locking the column in that case, and whatever that value is, we want to see what revenue got sold basically a month ago. So where are we going to look for that? Well, let's look for it up here, right? And when our revenue, when our sales got made, so to speak. And then what we're going to return then is the value for that particular customer. So in this case, locking the columns, not the rows. That way it'll float down for us once we have our formula, right? Now in this case, we get an NA, right? It's not finding what it's looking for. So let's copy this thing to the right. Let's actually go all the way out to the right and see what we see, right? It looks like it's almost never working, right? And that's probably because those dates are never exactly lining up, right? It's looking for an exact match, and the NA means it's not finding anything. So what we need to do is use approximate matching in this case. So if we go into our formula with F2, the first option is an if not found, kind of replaces these error messages if you'd like. Or we get to what we want here, which is the approximate matching. And here we have to figure out, do we want the exact match? No, that didn't work. So now do we want the next smaller item or the next larger item? In this case, because we're looking backwards, we actually want the next smaller item. Because if a sale happened 30 days ago, well, only if it happened before 30 days ago would we collect it now. If it happened after 30 days ago, the greater than number, we're not going to get that until the next week. So we're going to use the minus one here, and let's see what we get. Well, still error messages on that one, but let's copy it across. All right, once we copy it across, we see we get error messages until we get to 218. All right, that's in February 11th. Well, that's the first time we would get this order back here from January. All right, so that's the time difference that's happening. So the last thing we want to do is clean this up so we don't see the NAs. In this model, they like to put double dashes. That's kind of the A&M style. So we put that in, and now we have nice dashes across. All right, as long as we built our formula properly, we can just copy that down, and looks like that populates nicely. And we see that for customers with 60-day payables, or 60-day terms, they don't start getting cash until a little bit later from those customers, and even later for these 90-day terms. All right, so now we've got our receipts built, we've got our revenue recognized. Our last piece is actually to forecast our accounts receivable. So let's go ahead and build this out. So accounts receivable at the start of the month, that's always equal to what it was at the end of last month, right? So just a nice little reference of the previous time. Now what makes accounts receivable go up is selling stuff. So we can just reference our total sales. What makes it go down? Minus collecting stuff, right? So the more we collect, well, once we collect it, it's no longer a receivable. There's an other line built into the model, just gives us flexibility. We don't need it in this case. So now to get our updated end of month AR, we just add those up and we got our number. If we copy this out to the right now we've built that all the way out and we've got our AR through the end of the month, through the end of the forecast period rather. All right, the last thing to do is this is actually a trailing 13-week revenue. So what was the revenue in the last 13 weeks? We can sum this up. Let's come down to our revenue number. And I'm just going to scroll right. And notice as I'm scrolling right, you can see down here in the left corner, if I circle it there, it shows me that I have 13 columns. It's just a nice, easy way. Instead of having to count, I'm just going to use Excel to do that for me. All right, we got our 13-week forecast, and we're set there. The last thing is this column is illustrative days sales outstanding. Here we just got to know the formula. It's basically the ratio of the AR to the sales, and then times 90 to reflect it in days. So in this case, 54 days. Again, we copy that across, and we have our model filled out. All right, so we've built most of the data that was important to driving this model now, and now we can go back and look at our main control tab, and we should see that everything's updated nicely for us. All right, we had the links pre-built. Now we have these really nice graphs that kind of show us when we're in trouble or when we're not. In this case right now, we see we have some funding issues when we hit our 4th week of our cash flow forecast, our 1st week, and then again in weeks 12 and 13. All right, so we have some issues to kind of resolve and look at, but that's something we can now take to the client and work through together. Now the last piece of the case, as far as answering questions go, is using this data table to do some analysis. What the data table is doing is it's looking at some of the factors driving this, like this pro forma adjusted revenue, and then also the adjusted terms. So do you collect things sooner or later, and then do we bump our revenue forecast up or down? And you can ultimately see what's the worst that your cash position gets in those different scenarios, and we can do a lot of analysis around that. So the data table is built for you. The idea is now you can play with it, try to get the answers out from the questions, and really use the model to help inform the business decisions that are important. So thanks for tuning in for this month's edition of the Microsoft Excel Collegiate Challenge. I want to thank Alvarez and Marcel again for giving us some insight into their world, what they do, how they build models, and how they make them look really nice at the end of the day. I hope you enjoy working on this model and many of the other models we've published. Remember, if you complete 6 out of the 9 activities in this season of the MECC, you'll get a completion of certificate. It's something you really highlight on your resume, post on LinkedIn, let employers know that you're engaging in extra stuff outside the classroom to really make yourself better and build your skills. We'll have more models coming out soon, and we have the big finals of the MECC happening here in December. So stay tuned and excel on.